Well, welcome to the Family Building Podcast. We are excited to have attorney Danielle Augustin with us today, and she's going to be talking about a very unique set of rights that you as parents have regarding your children, and that's regarding education and benefits. Even I was not aware of until I met Danielle. So we're excited to have you, Danielle. How you doing?
I'm good. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, go ahead and take it away. Why don't you introduce yourself, Danielle?
I'm Danielle Augustin. I'm a special education attorney. I've been practicing in this area of law for 23 years. Prior to that, I was a deputy district attorney for about 4 years. And that led me into this area of law because my last assignment was in truancy court as a prosecutor. And I started noticing a pattern of kids and parents that were coming to me that I was prosecuting. And a lot of them had disabilities or special education needs or IEPs, or they couldn't go to school, and kind of turned the light on for me. And I didn't understand why that was happening because I wasn't in the special education system yet as a parent. But soon after that, my oldest son was diagnosed with autism, and I found myself on the other side of the table very quickly. And that really changed my life. And I left the DA's office 23 years ago and opened up a private practice focused on special education law, and it's become my life's work.
Danielle, what's the name of your law practice?
Augustine Egglesey LLP. I have a partner that we have been together almost 20 years. So I started off on my own as a sole practitioner, hung my shingle, um, didn't know much about special ed at the time. But I was really eager to learn. I wanted to know more about it, and I knew that I had a calling. And so I hit the ground running, and I started making connections. Would go down to Superior Court. They had an educational law panel at the time, and they put me on the panel, and I quickly learned and started taking cases, dependency cases, foster youth, kids in the system in 300, in the 300 system in dependency, and then 602 cases where kids were there because they had been accused of um, violating a penal code. So I got to see a lot and learn a lot in that time period, and was representing kids and appointed by the court in that situation. And that really gave me a ton of experience working with all sorts of families. And that really brought me into the world of foster and adoption. And I started to see a big crossover with kids that came from the foster system and who were in the pending or had been adopted. So I started seeing that huge crossover into special education. And me, I'm also an adoptive mother myself. I have four
Yeah.
children. Yes. And so, as an adoptive mother myself, we adopted our daughter, Gracie, when she was 21 months, and she's now going to be 21 this year. And that has been the most beautiful journey for our family. So, I have been on that side of it too as an adoptive mother. And so, that really, I think, has given me a really soft spot in the area of adoption and that crossover into special education. And I think when those intersect, which happens a lot, it requires even more nuanced, I think, advocacy just because of, the history of these kiddos and what the families are struggling with.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's the real intersection with family building. Obviously, we are doing foster care adoptions and all types of adoptions, step parent adoptions. But these kids coming out of foster care are kids that we're actually working with that are potentially are disrupting adoptions because they were born abroad. They came from a lot of trauma, and I can see where there is such a special need for education of our clients. That's why we're so excited to talk to you, Danielle. I wanted to ask just real quickly, without we'll get into the details later, but on your website it says do special education advocacy, including suspensions, expulsion hearings, involuntary transfers, IEP meetings, 504 meetings, resolutions, sessions, mediations, and due process hearings, as well as appeals and federal matters. Knowing our audience are adoptive parents and your own personal experience, how can you take all that language, those sort of legalese, and make it relevant to our clients today?
Well, special education is a system and it is incredibly complex. And I think a lot of families in that situation where they're either fostering or they have adopted a child or children, as you mentioned, some of them come from, um, I would call sometimes chaos, trauma. Some kids have come without being educated and they should have been in the educational system for years, or they've been educated, but the biological family or whoever was had the educational rights of that child before coming into being adopted didn't know how to advocate for supports and services, so they were left without services or an education. And so when adoptive parents come into this, their focus is making sure the child's safe, welcoming them to their family, of course. But there's this other layer that I think a lot of families just don't really get enough training in, and that is how to navigate the special education system. And because it's so complex, that's why we offer representation at all stages of the process, from eligibility to going to your first IEP or even a 504, to what's an appropriate IEP, assessments, what assessments are needed, are the assessments appropriate, are the goals, the services, the placement, every aspect of an IEP, is it appropriate, sufficient? There's special education law that's not written for parents in mind. It's got a lot of legalese and it's hard sometimes for parents to grasp the law. And so that's why we provide that kind of representation from the first step in the process to the very end, which could end up in litigation, could be due process, as you mentioned, resolution sessions, mediations, and of course, hearings.
So I'm at work, say I'm a parent raising a child, and let's say that the child did come from difficult circumstances. Maybe the child was raised for the first year or two. It may be including grandparents. We do a lot of grandparent guardianships where the children, their grandchildren, and bounced around different caregivers. Maybe their daughter or son is now using drugs, and they get involved with raising their grandchildren. But if we as parents are seeing that the child might be struggling, is this something we start observing as early as, say, kindergarten? What should we be looking for in terms of signs or the need for the possibility of further rights and advocacy inside the educational system?
A lot of parents don't know this, but school districts are responsible for special education supports and services starting at the age of 3. So when a child is approaching their third birthday, if parents are seeing needs, there's difficulty with speech and language, fine motor, behavior concerns. The district is responsible for evaluating students that may have a disability. They don't have to have a diagnosis, and parents don't even have to ask for an assessment. Now, if they're 3 and they're not in school, they would probably need to. There might be some other referral agencies that might help them get to the district, but school districts have what's called a mandate, child find mandate, to seek and find children that may require special education. So parents are not required to ask for it, although they can and they often do. But districts must reach out to the family, especially for kids who are of school age or in school, and they must offer them an assessment plan if they're showing signs that they may have a disability that would require specialized academic instruction or specialized services. So many parents don't really understand that. And school districts are also responsible for a child's education through their high school graduation. And if they don't graduate high school and they're on what's called a certificate track of completion, they're actually responsible through the child's 22nd birthday. So 3 to 22, that age range is actually the responsibility of the school district. If a school district doesn't reach out and offer an assessment plan, what I would recommend is families put it in writing. What the concerns are, send it to the school, send it to the district, and say, these are our concerns, and we think our child needs an assessment. The district has to respond within a reasonable time and provide an assessment plan or a reason why they aren't assessing.
when you say assessment, like who does that assessment? And is there any other language that goes along with, or is it just an assessment that we're asking for?
It really depends. So there are multiple assessments that a school district could be responsible for. The most basic assessment is a psychoeducational assessment, which is typically done by a school psychologist. That's going to cover everything from cognitive skills to processing, some fine motor, although that could be done by an occupational therapist, notably social emotional behavior concerns and adaptive skills. That's what a school psychologist, and most assessments are going to have a psychoeducational component. That's like your main assessment. Then there are related services because school districts are responsible for related services. So if a student is having struggles in social skills, might have trouble speaking and having expressive language or receptive language deficits, a speech and language pathologist would need to do a speech and language assessment. There's fine motor concerns, sensory processing concerns. An occupational therapist would conduct that assessment. There are other assessments for kids that aren't even able to speak, augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, adaptive physical education for kids who might need help in PE, mental health, behavior. There's tons of lots of different assessments. Any area where a student may require services, the district's responsible to assess, and each individual staff person is assigned to do that assessment. So you might walk into an IEP meeting and you might have 10 professionals standing there with 10 reports, which is why this can get very overwhelming very quickly for families, which is why we try and help families prepare for those meetings, not go in without the assessments ahead of time, record IEP meetings within 20 with 24 hours written notice, all these little tips that really help families come in prepared because it can be overwhelming.
So the assessment process takes place. What do you see in your practice and with your clients? Then after the assessment, is this something now falls on us as parents as our responsibility, our financial responsibility to now go out and seek out those services? Or is there provision, financial provision through the educational system?
The cornerstone of federal and state special education law is what's called FAPE, free appropriate public education. And every letter in that acronym has a lot of history, case law underneath that, and interpreting that. And the key is it is free to each family, and they're not required to pay for anything. So all of these services must be provided at no cost and clearly outlined in the IEP. What tends to happen sometimes, though, is parents don't fully understand this, or they see their child struggling even with an IEP or without an IEP, and they start funding tutoring. They start funding mental health services, speech and language, or whatever services they feel their child needs to be successful in school, not fully understanding whether or not the school district's responsible for any of those services or whether they're just frustrated that the services they're getting are not enough. So they start supplementing. That can be a denial of FAPE based on the many of that could be free, the appropriateness of it. And so FAPE is really clear, and families may be entitled to reimbursement for some of those privately funded services.
So, Danielle, in this first 15 minutes, we just wanted to kind of lay a foundation and say to those parents out there, hey, you have rights and maybe you're not aware of them. We raised 6 children. One was adopted, and we had a few foster children. And at one point, the local elementary school said that my wife and I had the worst behaved child in the school. And it was interesting that even as we struggled with that little boy who was in foster care, and was getting services through the foster care system, some therapy. The school never mentioned any of these. And when I look back now at that little boy's life, and I would have known the resources that were available and how we could have advocated, we would have had him fully assessed because he, we did not keep him in our home for more than 2 years, and he is now adopted. But I mean, he has continued to struggle because he went through a lot of trauma in his life. So this is very personal to me, Danielle, and I just want to take this first podcast to kind of lay the foundation to basically say you have rights and there's a lot of things you need to know. However, we're going to record a second session, and Danielle, you have come up with a way that you can begin to scale this information for adopting parents or for any parent that has a child that is struggling. And we're going to pick that up on the next episode. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you back at episode 2.